Oh, hi there. It's just me working on my manuscript. Just Nick Carraway, your narrator. Oh, I guess I should read you guys my story. Uh, my psychiatrist told me I had to do this, so here we go. Tell me if you like, okay? Get these long hairs out of the way. Chapter 1. In my younger and more vulnerable years, my father gave me some advice that I've been turning over in my mind ever since. Whenever you feel like criticizing anyone, he told me, just remember that all the people in this world haven't had the advantages that you've had. He didn't say any more, but we've always been unusually communicative in a reserved way. And I understood that he meant a great deal more than that. In consequence, I'm inclined to reserve all judgments, a habit that has opened up many curious natures to me and also made me the victim of not a few veteran bores. The abnormal mind is quick to detect and attach itself to this quality when it appears in a normal person. And so it came about that in college, I was unjustly accused of being a politician because I was privy to the secret griefs of wild, unknown men. Most of the confidences were unsought. Frequently, I have feigned sleep, preoccupation, or a hostile levity when I realized by some unmistakable sign that an intimate revelation was quivering on the horizon. For the intimate revelations of young men, or at least the terms in which they express them, are usually plagiaristic and marred by obvious suppressions. Reserving judgments is a matter of infinite hope. I'm still a little afraid of missing something if I forget that, as my father snobbishly suggested, and I snobbishly repeat. A sense of the fundamental decencies is parceled out unequally at birth. And after boasting this way of my tolerance, I come to the admission that it has a limit. Conduct may be founded on the hard rock or the wet marshes, but after a certain point, I don't care what it's founded on. When I came back from the East last autumn, I felt that I wanted the world to be in uniform and at a sort of moral attention forever. I wanted no more riotous excursions with privileged glimpses into the human heart. Only Gatsby, the man who gives his name to this book, was exempt from my reaction. Gatsby, who represented everything for which I have an unaffected scorn. If personality is an unbroken series of successful gestures, then there was something gorgeous about him, some heightened sensitivity to the promises of life, as if he were related to one of those intricate machines that register earthquakes 10,000 miles away. This responsiveness had nothing to do with that flabby impressionability which is dignified under the name of the creative temperament. It was an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person, and which it is not likely I shall ever find again. No, Gatsby turned out all right at the end. It was what preyed on Gatsby, what foul dust floated in the wake of his dreams, that temporarily closed out my interest in the abortive sorrows and short-winded elations of men. Okay, so you're introduced to the narrator, Nick Carraway. He is writing this book. He talks about when he came back from the East. So you guys are going to find out shortly that he is in the present, and he's talking about a time a while back when he was on the East Coast, like in the New York area, and where he met a man named Gatsby. And this isn't like shrugging off, oh, I met some guy named Gatsby. He says he had an extraordinary gift for hope, a romantic readiness such as I have never found in any other person and will never find again. So there's something about this Gatsby that has really struck a chord with Nick Carraway, and he's going to write an entire novel about his experience with him. So now he's going to go into a little bit of the background to this. My family have been prominent, well-to-do people in this Middle Western city for 3 generations. The Carraways are something of a clan. We have a tradition that we're descended from the Dukes of Buccleuch. But the actual founder of my line was my grandfather's brother, who came here in 51, sent to substitute the Civil War, and started the wholesale hardware business that my father carries on today. I never saw this great uncle, but I'm supposed to look like him, with special reference to the rather hard-boiled painting that hangs in Father's office. I graduated from New Haven in 1915. So New Haven is a reference to Yale, which is a really famous university in the United States, an Ivy League university, okay? Just a quarter of a century after my father. And a little later, I participated in that delayed Teutonic migration known as the Great War. I enjoyed the counter raid so thoroughly that I came back restless. Instead of being the warm center of the world, the Middle West now seemed like the ragged edge of the universe. So I decided to go east and learn the bond business. Everybody I knew was in the bond business, so I supposed it could support one more single man. All my aunts and uncles talked it over as if they were choosing a prep school for me, and finally said, "Why, yes," with very grave, hesitant faces. Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east permanently, I thought, in the spring of 22. So in 1922, he heads from the Midwest to New York, and he's going to get into the bond business, so the financial market business. The practical thing was to find rooms in the city, but it was a warm season, and I had just left a country of wide lawns and friendly trees. So when a young man at the office suggested that we take a house together in a commuting town, it sounded like a great idea. He found the house, a weather-beaten cardboard bungalow at $80 a month, but at the last minute, the firm ordered him to Washington, and I went out to the country alone. I had a dog. At least I had him for a few days until he ran away. And an old Dodge and a Finnish woman who made my bed and cooked breakfast and muttered Finnish wisdom to herself over the electric stove. It was lonely for a day or so until one morning, some man, more recently arrived than I, stopped me on the road. "How do you get to West Egg Village?" he asked helplessly. I told him, and as I walked on, I was lonely no longer. I was a guide, a pathfinder, an original settler. He had casually conferred on me the freedom of the neighborhood. And so, with the sunshine and the great bursts of leaves growing on trees, just as things grow in fast movies, I had that familiar conviction that life was beginning over again with the summer. There was so much to read, for one thing, and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young, breath-giving air. I bought a dozen volumes on banking and credit and investment securities, and they stood on my shelf in red and gold like new money from the mint, promising to unfold the shining secrets that only Midas and Morgan and Mycenaeus knew. And I had the high intention of reading many other books besides. I was rather literary in college. One year I wrote a series of very solemn and obvious editorials for the Yale News. And now I was going to bring back all such things into my life and become again the most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man. This isn't just an epigram. Life is much more successfully looked at from a single window, after all. It was a matter of chance that I should have rented a house in one of the strangest communities in North America. It was on that slender, riotous island, which extends itself due east of New York, and where there are, among other natural curiosities, 2 unusual formations of land. 20 miles from the city, a pair of enormous eggs, identical in contour and separated only by a courtesy bay, jut out into the most domesticated body of salt water in the Western Hemisphere, the great wet barnyard of Long Island Sound. They're not perfect ovals. Like the egg in the Columbus story, they are both crushed flat at the contact end, but their physical resemblance must be a source of perpetual confusion to the gulls that fly overhead. To the wingless, a more arresting phenomenon is their dissimilarity in every particular except shape and size. Okay, so in the Long Island Sound, so Long Island, New York, there are two round, sort of like juts, and they call them the eggs. Okay, so they're like residential communities across a bay from each other. So there's East Egg and West Egg. Okay, and they kind of look at each other. And he says they are virtually identical in size and shape, these two areas, but they are completely different in every other way. I lived at West Egg, the less fashionable of the two, though this is a most superficial tag to express the bizarre and not a little sinister contrast between them. My house was at the very tip of the egg, only 50 yards from the Sound, and squeezed between two huge places that rented for 12 or 15,000 a season. So he pays $80 a month in this little shack next to these huge houses that in 1922 rented for 12 or $15,000 for the summer. So when you think about just the size and the scope and what this neighborhood is like, even though he says he's on the less fashionable side, obviously it's still quite sought after to demand a price like that. The one on my right was a colossal affair by any standard. It was a factual imitation of some Hotel de Ville in Normandy, with a tower on one side, spanking new under a thin beard of raw ivy, and a marble swimming pool, and more than 40 acres of lawn and garden. It was Gadsby's mansion. Or rather, as I didn't know Mr. Gadsby, it was a mansion inhabited by a gentleman of that name. My own house was an eyesore, but it was a small eyesore, and it had been overlooked. So I had a view of the water, a partial view of my neighbor's lawn, and the and the consoling proximity of millionaires, all for $80 a month. Across the Courtesy Bay, the white palaces of fashionable East Egg glittered along the water. And the history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans. Daisy was my second cousin once removed, and I'd known Tom in college. And just after the war, I spent 2 days with them in Chicago. So we find out that East Egg is like the old money, okay? And that's where Tom and Daisy Buchanan live. And just to point out to you guys, at this time, when you think about the role of women, Daisy Buchanan was probably referred to quite a bit as Mrs. Tom Buchanan by her husband's name, and that was not at all unusual. So her identity wholly belongs to him after marriage. Is his identity that interconnected to hers? Absolutely not. Okay. So Daisy and Tom Buchanan have come from Chicago, and they've moved to the very fashionable and expensive East Egg. And so this is Nick's cousin, second cousin once removed, whatever that means. They shouldn't date, probably, right? So he goes to have dinner with Tom and Daisy Buchanan in East Egg. Her husband, who is quite the character, among various physical accomplishments, had been one of the most powerful ends that ever played football at New Haven. A national figure in a way, one of those men who reached such an acute, limited excellence at 21 that everything afterwards savors of anticlimax. His family were enormously wealthy. Even in college, his freedom with money was a matter for reproach. But now he'd left Chicago and come east in a fashion that rather took your breath away. For instance, he'd brought down a string of polo ponies from Lake Forest. It was hard to realize that a man in my own generation was wealthy enough to do that. Why they came east, I don't know. They had spent a year in France for no particular reason, and then drifted here and there unrestfully wherever people played polo and were rich together. This was a permanent move, said Daisy over the telephone, but I didn't believe it. I had no sight into Daisy's heart, but I felt that Tom would drift on, forever seeking a little wistfully for the dramatic turbulence of some irrecoverable football game. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening, I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion overlooking the bay. The lawn started at the beach and ran toward the front door for a quarter of a mile, jumping over sundials and brick walls and burning gardens. Finally, when it reached the house, drifting up the side in bright vines, as though from the momentum of its run. The front was broken by a line of French windows, glowing now with reflected gold and wide open to the warm, windy afternoon. And Tom Buchanan, in riding clothes, was standing with his legs apart on the front porch. Okay, so we are in the first chapter introduced to the first party. So it's really interesting. In The Great Gatsby, the first 3 chapters, we go to 3 different parties. Each chapter is a different party. So the first one is a very formal dinner party at Tom and Daisy Buchanan's house. Their house is enormous, beyond belief. Okay. He has all of his like polo ponies there. He is that 1%. Okay. He is that old wealth that even Nick can't believe that someone of his generation would have that kind of wealth. Okay. The house is gold and wide open. So this is symbolic of just the amount of money that these people are playing with. And they're literally playing. People in this position would not have a job. Okay. Their job would be to ride horses and visit and throw dinner parties. All right. So that's kind of what they are used to experiencing. Their past, Tom and Daisy, is described by Nick as unrestful. So they've jumped around from Chicago to France. Now they're in Long Island, and they just hop wherever other rich people happen to be. Tom, you guys are going to see, is this like embodiment of masculine brutality. Okay. So the way that he is described is really physical, competitive, like this alpha. All right. He is really unlikable. But I do quite appreciate the way that he is described. He feels very real to me. Like you might know somebody like that. Someone like brutish and physical, and even the way he stands. So he's like waiting on this at the front of this house with his legs apart on the porch. So just this like very like Gaston, right? From Beauty and the Beast. That's kind of how I think of Tom Buchanan. So I will catch the next part of this chapter in a little bit.